Hello and welcome to the Data Center Reality Check webinar. My name is Dave Grimshaw with CDS. I'm Director of Marketing and will be your moderator for today's webinar. Today we are very excited to have with us Mr. Mike Zuber, our Vice President of Sales for the Americas here at CDS, and he'll be your host. I'd also like to introduce our panelists, if I may. The first is Mr. Mr. Armenti, who is a production support engineer with Lord Abbett Company, which is a financial services organization in the United States. Joe is the IT practitioner with over 15 years experience within the IT community. He has been with several influential organizations such as Ernst & Young, and for the past 10 years he has been with Lord Abbett Company. During his time he has been instrumental in managing their production environment and has been involved in a wide range of projects including infrastructure and applications. Welcome, Joe.
Thank you.
Also with us today is Mr. Keith Koo, Managing Partner and Co-founder of Guardian Insight Group. They have worked with a number of high-profile companies such as PayPal and will share with us today his insights about how his clients have advanced their data center strategies through working with a TPM or third-party maintainer to better manage the assets lifecycle. Welcome, Keith.
Thanks. Thank you very much.
At this point, we want to turn things over to Mike Zuber to introduce today's webinar topic.
Thanks, Dave, and thanks, Joe and Keith, for attending. Today's webinar is to focus on how can we better manage the life cycle of your data center assets and how an alternative support provider can be an integral part of the overall IT business decision-making. We're going to kick this off with our panel, and to have a discussion on typical business drivers that cause IT departments to assess what is kind of the true life cycle of their hardware assets. Most businesses struggle with product life and when to roll to new assets, and they struggle with items like our returns on investment, OPEX expense, etc. So let's start this off with our first topic then. What are the typical business drivers that cause IT to assess the true lifespan of their hardware? Keith, would you start off the discussion, please?
Great. Yeah, thanks, Mike. So very typical question with the companies I've been involved with and our clients. And really, we could broadly say it's a risk management exercise, but in this aspect, the risk is financial driven. So you're in the middle of a technology, you've had it for a number of years, and you may or may not have, as an IT group or technology group, really understood what the total cost of ownership is. Your finance group, your FP&A department, becomes aware of a growing expense line, either CapEx or OPEX or cash flow based, and therefore it causes you to need to evaluate that. That isn't actually my preferred method. My preferred method would be that you have an enterprise architecture or infrastructure architecture team that maps out the full life cycle of the asset or the technology prior to engaging that technology stack, but oftentimes in practicality it doesn't actually happen. So through that, also related to financial risk, there's oftentimes economic stress in industries. If you imagine financial services right now or retail, others, they may have done everything right in planning, but an economic crisis, the same finance group says you need to cut your expenses, then what do you do, right? So that's on the financial side. On the operational risk side, there are things like regulations, especially in financial services and compliance, where you initially adopted a technology and over time it became more critical, and now it's antiquated, but you really can't move off of it for record retention reasons, compliance reasons. So now you have to support those assets even though they've obsolesced. So that's another quite frequent driver of needing to come up with an alternative plan, so to speak.
Thanks, Keith. Appreciate that. Sure. Joe, do you mind given some thoughts as well?
Hello?
Hi, Joe.
Yes, okay. I didn't hear you for a second.
Thank you. Joe, please go ahead and give us some thoughts.
You didn't hear me?
We can hear you just fine. Yep.
Oh, okay. Thank you. So for us here in a financial firm that I'm in, the different business units really drive the lifespan of some of these assets. So they all have their own individual requirements, and that really drives us to know which assets are economic, what is actually needed to run their applications, and of course economic conditions come into play as well, being a financial firm, IT budget, and cost. But really, as far as we're concerned, and of course, as Keith mentioned, compliance, that is also a huge factor here where I am and how we do things. But yeah, those business units really are driving us, so we really have to work closely with them and fulfill their needs.
Thanks, Joe. Appreciate that. I just want to point out to the audience that we value and appreciate your questions. There is a question button on the panel. If you have a question you want to pose to the panel, please type that in, and we'll make sure it gets read to them. So back to the panel, guys. There's different assets in your enterprise space: network, storage, tape, server, et cetera, appliances. Can you talk about what you view the different lifespans of those products, and when you would consider an alternative support provider for those? Keith, would you start, please?
Sure. Being in the heart of Silicon Valley, I've seen over the last 15 years different progressions on how we treat assets. And the reason why I bring that up, companies moving to cloud-based services or SaaS-based services, either private or public cloud, will have a very different view on their asset strategy or technology strategy versus others. And so it's a very broad question, but I can speak in high-level terms that in one of my previous companies, for instance, and even at PayPal, the need to store data on your aging storage infrastructure. Before you do a migration, you have to pick what your cloud actual strategy is, because that's going to dictate how you continue to maintain the existing infrastructure. And that's where I think companies in that similar situation really need to look at third-party support as a viable, either interim solution or something that can bridge them when they make that technology shift, because it doesn't make sense for an enterprise to reinvest in that same platform if they will ultimately be out of it completely, right? So that was just one example. And I also do encourage the audience to ask specific questions so that that might be on their minds.
Agreed. We look forward to the questions. So some of the thoughts that I want to place out there as well is and we'll move to Joe, but some of the assets, you have your internal assets and customer-facing assets, mission-critical assets versus backup and recovery, test labs, and so on. So that also play into it. Joe, would you take it from there?
Sure. As far as our lifespan, our different networking, I guess, is our longest. We tend to keep our network infrastructure in place. We don't really try and sway from that. I guess also our servers, that is also a longer lifespan, which is where CDS comes into play there. We have a lot of critical applications in the financial district that need and rather are preferred to live on the same hardware. So that's where CDS comes in and allows us to keep those older servers, per se, alive and well. As far as like disk storage and tape storage, those vary, although, they vary on aggressive renewals, different price structures. But the servers is where, our old servers, so to say, is really where CDS comes through for us there.
Hi guys, Dave Grimshaw here. Just one of the things in terms of, for many, many years I've been hearing about, tape drives are dead and tape is dead in general. And you guys want to weigh in on, where you see the future of tape? I know that some of you guys as customers have been using tapes for an extended period of time. Do you see that trend continuing at all? Keith, if you want to start that one off.
Sure. So again, having a mix of many years in financial services and in technology, it's going to depend. Back at when I was at Intuit, which is both a tech and a financial services company, we tried to move away from tape as much as possible. So we were actively living that let's get rid of tape, and we were moving to high availability disaster recovery and active data centers. And so you can't get rid of tape completely in a financial services company, but we were able to put our data strategy and storage into these will still remain on tape, and these are all going to be in an active configuration. I don't think, I would say most companies probably don't have that same luxury if they're not in that situation. And so now you're going to be looking at, again, what are your records management, record retention policies when it comes to corporate data, and then when it's engineering data, similar but not necessarily regulated, what are your strategies around that? And so I think many organizations are aspirational in that they want to move off of tape, but I don't think it's a practicality in the near term.
Thanks, Keith. Appreciate it, Keith. Listen, when you're going through an assessment to decide when to move to an alternative support provider or a third-party provider, it takes time to do that. If you got a feel for kind of start to finish how long that process is, and as it gets elongated, what were some of the key roadblocks, and how did you get past them? Joe, you want to take that shot?
Sure. I feel like that assessment for us is actually ongoing. I don't feel like it ever really ends because a lot of our, again, driven by our business units, their needs tend to change quite often. So, it depends on the offers, the cost, and it depends on what hardware they really need. So I really feel like it's just really an ongoing process for us. Even though we're a smaller firm, it just seems to change pretty rapidly.
Right, so it sounds like you're dedicating resources that constantly assess the usage by business function, by the economic drivers outside of Abbott & Co, to make sure that you have what the business needs rather than what somebody's telling you need. Now, we do have a question from the audience, and thanks for that, is how is cloud storage changing the market, and what are the risks associated with that? Any of you guys want to take a stab at this one?
Sure. Or Joe, go ahead if you'd like to go. But
yeah, we're not really doesn't really apply to us much. Maybe you can elaborate.
Okay. Yeah. So cloud storage is definitely changing the market. I'll make a blanket statement that, especially if you're a mid-sized company or smaller, cloud storage might make all the sense in the world. What normally at a major bank I was just at, they didn't want to adopt cloud yet not because they couldn't do it from a skill and ability, but it was the fear of data protection, regulatory compliance, et cetera, especially for some of the major North American banks. So the main risk, again, of, I would say, beyond financial is once you've moved your data, so we'll talk specifically about data, into the cloud, do you know where it sits? Do you have control over it? What if it gets hacked, et cetera? But then the what I talk to a lot of my clients about is that even though that may be the case, reflect inward to your own organization. Could you do that a better job than your cloud provider could? And a very good use case is a major consulting firm about a year ago said they were dropping all internal email support. This is a 300,000 person company, and moving to Google Enterprise for email because they believe Google would be a better email provider than they could do it themselves, right?
Thanks, Joe.
So the broader question of how is cloud storage changing the market, it can be a very viable option economically, but again, for example, like a company like AWS, Amazon Web Services, you could also totally blow up your financial model if you don't architect how that data gets touched. And a really good use case for that, if you look it up, is Groupon just a few months ago moved off of cloud and back onto on-prem because they had messed up how they architected their cloud solution.
Thanks, guys, for that insight. Appreciate it, answering the question. A lot of clients look to move into an alternative or a third-party support as the OEM end of support life comes on. And we find more and more that those decisions are being made prior to end of support life and towards the end of warranty. Can you talk a little bit about some of the decisions you've had to make moving to a third-party organization or an alternative support organization, and in what part in the life cycle is it most important for you? Joe, you want to take that?
Sure. That end of life in our decision making, a little less than half is actually the amount. Our highest consideration is really the risk of data loss. Just with these high-profile financial applications that we're running, that's really our number one. And of course, the cost. I mean, just like anybody else, the cost is going to be a major consideration, but also the compliance that we've mentioned before. We're very restricted here, driven by the business units and their regulatory requirements. So that also is, very important in that cycle.
Good, appreciate that, Keith. Your view on when is the right time to start reviewing alternative support solutions?
My view is never a bad time. As a follow-up to one of the earlier questions, I think it starts with a proper asset management practice within the organization, and if you have that, you're on top of the asset, you're on top of when, even before end of service life, you have end of life. And at the moment that you have an ongoing relationship with your major server provider, for instance, and you know that an asset's going to go end of life and then end of service life, however many years after that, you better be thinking about what the alternatives then. And the alternatives could be a tech refresh, or if you already know that you're going to be stuck with this technology but you're sunsetting it, that's the point in time, or like I said, never a bad time to develop that alternative strategy. End of service life is actually way too late. You're almost beholden to the OEM at that point, and there might not be any viable options, and that's where we hope that a TPM can satisfy that.
Appreciate that, and those are what we hear consistently from our clients.
Great. We have a question. What is your take on the Dell EMC merger, and do you think it's significant? Joe?
Well, I question, will this marriage work? That's really my number one concern. I don't know if it's really going to impact us right now, but I guess we'll have to see and wait. It's an interesting merger, actually, but I don't know really the impact it's going to be on us right now.
Keith, your thoughts?
Yeah. My take, back to what Joe said, I think in the short term, and really, if the participant who posed the question wanted to make it more specific, in terms of significant, I don't think it's significant operationally. Dell's strategy, I used to do M&A for Cisco Systems, right? So Dell's strategy for M&A, and I have friends in the subsidiaries, is to pretty much leave them alone. So, for instance, VMware, RSA, those are pretty much standalone, so they can be, spun out or spun in or what have you. So I don't think to the end user or customer, you necessarily should fear any type of operational risk. I think depending on how Dell decides to play it, really they're just trying to make sure they're competitive against the likes of a Cisco and Oracle or an HP or an IBM. But I do think that the longer-term strategy for Dell is to capture the small, medium, and mid-sized customer base that maybe the other big players hadn't focused so much on, and really take that approach. And I think longer-term, Dell's positioning themselves better is not necessarily a good term, because I don't want to show a bias, but they are positioned well for market shifts from companies wanting to adopt a public cloud, right? So they're trying to set up their units so that people who want to jump in and out, that they can be a player in that, so they're still capturing market share. So again, I don't think it's significant to how you run your business, but it's just something to think about as a provider of IT services.
Fantastic, thanks. Hopefully the panel has significantly answered the question that was asked. Our next talking point is around what the consideration needs to be made. So we've understood the importance of doing assessment, and as Joe articulated, that is around business-driven, and I think it's been followed by Keith, who also echoes that really the business requirements really drive the decisions around what equipment should be kept, what equipment should either be decommissioned, what equipment should be then cascaded. So can you guys talk a little bit more about what considerations that you should be looking at when now thinking about cascading that equipment, which is basically having it take on a different role within the organization you either work with or the organization you're currently working with today? Joe, you want to take that one, please?
So again, it's I know I've been maybe repeating the business unit driven, but that's just how it works, where I come from, and that's really what we have to consider at all times. We do consider other things, available resources, migrations, upgrades, decommissioning assets that we no longer really, really need. I mean, also there's usually an argument between what is needed and what is no longer needed, and that actually makes the process maybe just a little bit longer than it has to be. A lot of teams don't like to, disrupt things that are working. If it's not broke, don't fix it, even though a server may be, 8, 9, 10 years old. So we have to, it's really all just about what they need, what they want, their growth, their volume of data, and their ability to restore stuff and have their data available 24/7.
Right. And what about that? You touched, Joe, a little bit about data migration. I mean, that would then ideally, from a storage point of view, be significant. What's been your experience as it pertains to data migration? That's definitely going to drive the retirement of things. That data migration. We're going through that right now, actually. So there's a lot of movement right now with older equipment, newer equipment. But that's all, again, business-driven, and it's actually not even a big problem. It's just, again, just supplying those users what they need when they need it. Right. Keith, your thoughts on some of the risk or some of the considerations, if you will, around when is it time to cascade, best practices, how do you do that? Can you enlighten us a little bit on that?
Sure. And Joe gave a great answer, and ultimately it's the organization's risk appetite. That's a financial service term, right? So what's your appetite for risk on doing something? I think the number one fear is a data loss, which we've talked about, and data loss meaning that even if the data isn't lost, how easily accessible can we recover or get that data back? And it's an often quoted reason why people want to hang on to their old assets way past their useful life, that they might have missed something. And then you throw in business continuity and disaster recovery overall, and you get into a trap of, well, yes, you don't have the proper DR strategy in place, but then the longer that asset sits in your environment, the more risk you're incurring for two reasons. One, the equipment might just fail, and two, even if the equipment doesn't fail, you get into that end of service life, and whether or not at that point, even whether or not a third-party provider, even an expert one or an excellent one, can still get software support if needed, right? So I think a lot of companies get themselves into a trap, and then they get paralyzed on what to do. So all these things, I think, back to how do you take those into account? You need to set what your risk appetite is. What are things that you do as an organization care about? Run that by your audit team and your executives. But I think this should be an organizational effort, right? By business unit, as Joe was mentioning.
Right. You talked about one interesting point regarding things like software updates and things like that. So when you transition to a TPM, one of the things, as you know, TPMs are not legally bound or able to provide updates and patches, which is kind of why we talked a little bit about technology that's gone end of support life by the OEM. What's your experience been, both of you guys, regarding once you have made the transition to a TPM from OEM service in requiring software updates to maintain the equipment? Has that ever caused you problems, or do you see that happening? Keith?
I'm sorry, you broke up for just a second. So you're asking about once the migration to a TPM has occurred, what the experience has been?
Yeah, regarding software updates, I mean, that definitely would be one of the primary concerns that if I were a customer I would have is, you know, I'm no longer with the OEM, are software updates available? How would that provider deal with it? Is it a problem? Is it something that they should not be concerned about? What's been your experience, again, out there in quote-unquote the real world?
Well, in my experience, you're often able to, in most cases, still able to negotiate a software agreement directly with the OEM, even if they're not supporting the hardware. So that risk is somewhat mitigated unless you have like a really one-off technology. Then you got to take that as a case-by-case basis.
Right, and even for end of support life, I mean, because when the OEMs typically designate a piece of equipment for end of service life, the understanding is that they're no longer providing hardware and software support for that particular product.
Right. And so then the options there are, and this is where the risk management piece comes in, especially for financial service companies like banks. If you're already in that hole, you will now have to most likely determine whether it's a mission-critical application or infrastructure, and then you'll have to write up a justification why you're in essence going naked on coverage, and then what is your alternative? Are you going to a third-party consulting firm that will not indemnify you, but will provide best efforts there? And so I think when we talk about it, it's almost I like to caution companies, because if you get to that point, you have very limited options, and that's why it's important to partner with organizations such as CDS or others ahead of time, so you're not in that hole. Because explaining this to your regulator or auditor becomes a very uncomfortable situation.
Joe, you got a thought on that as well? We're running.
Yeah, I think in the past we've come across that end of life critical. Oh no, what are we going to do? We're not supported anymore, and that's happened quite a few times. But I think now, you know, in the last few years, partnering with CDS we're able to get ourselves, you know, in a better position, so we don't get to that point anymore, as what Keith was saying, because that was really a problem where, okay, now we have no choice because there is no more support. So yeah, these days it works a lot better now, partnering up.
I appreciate that, and I agree. I agree it's critical to understand your end-of-life strategy and understand your return on investment and when you're going to roll those products to a new OEM. Work closely with a third-party organization or an alternative support organization like CDS who can help you with that planning. We are almost out of time. Dave Grimshaw is going to wrap this up. I want to thank everybody for attending, and especially Joe and Keith for being on our panel. It was very informative, and I really appreciate every minute.
Great. Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Keith. And thanks to our attendees for attending today. For more information on CDS, you can visit our website at cds.net, or if you've got questions, you can send them through to sales@cds.net or marketing@cds.net. Thanks, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye for now.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.